This is a story about my town. This could be a story about your town. It's a tale about a public health issue that's been lost in the shadows of betrayal and denial. And if your town is like my town, pleasant streets that lie over a deep, dark secret. Upper Cape Cod is comprised of the towns of Sandwich, Bourne, Mashpee, and Falmouth. And those towns surround the Massachusetts Military Reservation. It was built in the 1930s and served the armed forces for World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and the Cold War. It's a quiet place now. And as fate would have it, in 1996, I took a position with a company that was hired by the military to clean up groundwater plumes that were emanating from the base. I worked for Jacobs Engineering for 5 years. I managed the CAD Graphics GIS department, where we made maps and figures for scientists and engineers, public presentations, and hundreds of reports. Back then, it was a hotbed of activity. Everyone had something to say. From the media to the military, the regulatory agencies, people in the towns, and environmental activists. There was a lot of controversy. There was a lot of money involved. And a lot of politics. We worked for AFC.
I'm Robert Gill. I am the project manager for the cleanup for the Air Force here at the Massachusetts Military Reservation. The Air Force is the lead agent for the cleanup here, which means we're responsible to provide the money and the people to conduct the cleanup.
My name is Douglas Carson, and I'm a community involvement specialist here for the Installation Restoration Program. I've been here at the reservation for over 18 years, officially since 1992 in a full-time capacity when I came to work for the program.
A number of different chemicals were spilled or released into the environment. Many of them inadvertently, some of them from wastewater treatment plants, from landfills or dumps, some of them just from maintenance activities, cleaning engines and degreasing parts, and then the material would be rinsed off of a concrete slab and go into the soil. These contaminants, once released into the soil over the years with rainfall falling on the soil, they would leach down into the groundwater of Cape Cod. Cape Cod is a very sandy, it's a big sandbar. And so once the contaminants got into the sandy groundwater, they started to migrate off the base. And when we became aware of this situation, we drilled a number of monitoring wells to try to find these plumes. In fact, we've drilled several thousand monitoring wells to date. And many of them came up clean, but many of them showed that contaminants had gotten into the groundwater and even migrated past the base boundary, off base, and underneath residential neighborhoods. Now I say underneath because as they would migrate through the groundwater, they would get deeper and deeper as more fresh rainwater would fall and would go into the aquifer on top of these plumes. They'd get deeper and deeper. But nonetheless, they were out in the towns around the base. And the Air Force recognized that we needed to clean them up. It's expected to take $850 million over the course of the entire project. We've probably spent a little over $500 million to date.
And it was very difficult in the 1990 through 93 time period where people just didn't believe us, because for the past 8+ years they had heard nothing but silence pretty much from the military. But we took the challenge. We started forming advisory groups that involved citizens, from the community, volunteering on things like an Ashuma Johns Pond Task Force, where they came up with recommendations to the military, which were funded and carried out. In 1993, we established what are called process action teams, again involving community volunteers, to sit on these panels to advise the military on things like cleaning up the groundwater plumes, searching for long-range water supplies, looking at innovative technologies. And that type of involvement has continued as we move into the mid-1990s up until where we are today.
And to date, we have cleanup systems on 8 of the groundwater plumes, and we have cleanup systems in design for several more. Now, a cleanup system consists of an extraction well, or a well that we withdraw contaminated groundwater out of the aquifer. We run it through a filter. Typically, it's a granular activated carbon filter, just kind of material you'd see in a fish tank aquarium filter or in a water filter that you'd keep in your refrigerator. And granular activated carbon will attract the contaminants out of the water. It absorbs to the carbon, and then clean fresh water comes out the other end, and we put the clean water back into the environment.
We're here at the Sandwich Road Treatment Facility located on the base, and behind me are 8 granular activated carbon vessels, each holding 20,000 pounds of carbon. The water comes in, is treated, and then it goes back out into the ground through reinjection wells. This particular plant was built back in 1997, has been in operation for 6 years, and is treating groundwater contamination associated with the Massachusetts Military Reservation. And the flow rate coming in to this plant is about 1,150 gallons per minute.
Now, these plumes typically are either solvent plumes, which were different kind of chemicals used in these industrial processes. The solvents particularly that we see in our plumes are either perchloroethylene or PCE, trichloroethylene or TCE, and carbon tetrachloride. The drinking water standard level for those contaminants is 5 parts per billion. So anything above 5 parts per billion is what we're concerned with finding. So anything above 5 parts per billion is what we're concerned with finding. And
parts per billion. And I was wondering if there's such a thing as a comparison between what that is in parts per million or billion.
Okay. Now, so you're announcing as the goal, the official goal of Jacobs, these 5 parts per billion for the whole thing.
Could you tell me what the number is in parts per billion for the average concentration level in the plume?
Is 5 parts per billion.
The drinking water standard level for those contaminants is 5 parts per billion.
Let me put this in perspective. When you talk about the contaminants here in the base, you're basically talking about solvents and fuel-related compounds. And there are 3 main contaminants. 2 are solvents, being TCE and PCE, and then a fuel-related compound is ethylene dibromide, or EDB. For ethylene dibromide, the drinking water standard is 0.02. The highest concentration of TCE that we've seen on the base is associated with what we call chemical spill 10. It's a plume over 5,000 parts per billion. This drinking water standard is 5, so it's much higher than that. PCE is probably around 400 to 500 parts per billion, the highest we've ever seen. Again, the standard is 5. In all cases, the contaminants that we've seen in these plumes have been only sporadically detected in area private wells. For instance, since 1995, the Air Force has been keeping a database of all the samples that we take in the 4 communities of private residential wells. We have approximately 700 homes that have been part of our sampling efforts to go out and sample the wells free of charge. And probably less than 1% of the thousands of samples that we've taken from those 700 homes have ever shown a plume-related constituent. And all of those test results have been within the safe drinking water standards. They've been basically trace levels, detectable, but not a risk to anybody that would be drinking or using that water for any purpose. Right. The Air Force has been successful at building cleanup systems, getting things in the ground, and conveying that to the public through a variety of means, through our public meetings.
So 1, 2, 3. I'm Jim Snyder. I'm in charge of the cleanup program for the Air Force.
Some cranberry bogs in this area.
Put out a word of caution.
And that can be a concern.
There were literally hundreds of meetings.
The goal is clean up the plumes line by line by line. Okay, treatment of the plumes to
Many were open to the public.
and cleanup of the plumes to background concentrations if feasible.
Patronizing manner, telling us that no
This was a
action
forum
further action
where residents could get information on the cleanup and to ask questions to the military
I-
or the regulatory agencies.
I just can't believe that we are paying good taxpayers' dollars, and lots of it, to engineers who don't have the common sense that, that God gave us stone.
We're not just charging anything.
You guys came in here a couple of months ago, I'm gonna let the whole SD5 plume go at 60 parts, and now you're coming in here and saying that the standard that we got to aim for.
This is also a platform for the environmentalists to be heard. There were a handful of activists who were very knowledgeable about the cleanup, and they were crucial in the early days by putting pressure on the military and the politicians to take action.
We have a sandwich road. I'd like to see some data.
I was wondering if EPA had commented on that schedule as well as the aspect dealing with the toxics.
In all these monitoring wells.
They were at times hostile and always disenchanted with the cleanup effort, always making accusations, always pointing the finger.
In effect, and geared towards pleasing the public. And sometimes it's a little bit of an act to get action, but I can't tell you how angry this.
They appeared very concerned about the public health and the cranberries.
Treated plume water is irrigating these cranberries. There could be an economic downturn.
If this were a private site, most of the people who are regulators and consultants would be in jail now.
Our cleanup, as I mentioned, the Air Force is the lead agent of the project funded by both the Army and the Air Force. We're regulated by agencies from both the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the state of Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. These regulators watch over the work we do. We present all of our findings to them. They help us develop plans. They help us present the information to the community. People on Cape Cod recognize that their drinking water supply is the aquifer under our feet. And they recognize that any threat to that aquifer is a threat to their way of life. We go and regularly give presentations in communities and towns, both to their elected officials and to citizens.
Meeting with civic groups and schools and sharing all the information that we have and what it means so people can make informed decisions, and that's what we've done.
One of our principal objectives in the cleanup is to protect public health. We test people's private wells that live around the base. We have converted a number of residences to public water. We also work with the town's boards of health, and we share all this information with, again, the regulatory agencies and with the towns and with the public by putting out press releases in the local newspapers so that people can be aware of what the situation is with the contaminants and the cleanup.
But it's been a success story, in my opinion. It hasn't been easy. There are a lot of lessons learned from our program.
But the goal is to continue to operate these treatment systems until the contamination is removed and the drinking water is safe again.
So everything seemed to be making sense until one day I went to the post office, where I received the Town of Falmouth's annual water quality report. And I noticed inside that there was a detection for PCE in the town's water at an elevation of 9.2 parts per billion. There was an explanation. It said it was coming from vinyl-lined pipes. But it left me wondering because it said that the 9.2 parts per billion was not a violation. In the past 4 years, I had been drawing maps of plumes coming from the military reservation. Anything over 5 parts per billion was called a hit and had to be included in a plume contour. This chemical was not coming from the base. PCE, also known as tetrachloroethylene, primarily used as a cleaning solvent in dry cleaning operations and also as a degreaser. The EPA has established a maximum contaminant level of 5 parts per billion. Anything over 5 is considered a health risk.
The drinking water standard level for those contaminants is 5 parts per billion.
The plumes from the base came from a source that would leach down into the soil and get into the groundwater. This contamination in the town's water supply was coming from the pipes that delivered water to people's homes. The vinyl liner was introduced in the 1960s in response to taste and odor complaints. A slurry of vinyl plastic and PCE was used to coat the inside of the pipes just before shipping. These pipes were installed from 1969 to 1983. Throughout Massachusetts, in 9 towns on Cape Cod, and several towns on Martha's Vineyard. Including the towns around the Massachusetts Military Reservation. I was curious about these pipes, so I went to the town's water department to look at their data, and there, amongst other things, I found a report that was published in 1980 that showed detections of PCE at 18,000 parts per billion. So I built a map showing the town's water supply pipes. And on top of that, I showed the locations of most of the vinyl line pipes in the town, here shown in orange. There are also points in the town called sample locations, where the state or the town would take water samples. Here's a list of these streets where samples would be taken. But if you look at the map, you'll see not all the streets are being sampled. I felt I needed to go further, so I submitted a request to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP, to look at their data for the town of Falmouth. And there I found any number of sheets that show that PCE was detected at various locations throughout the town. Here's a neighborhood in North Falmouth. I've enhanced the detections in red. You'll see as you go further up the street that the detections tend to increase. That's because the water sits longer in the pipes. These samples were taken from hydrants on the street. Here's 2 images of the same neighborhood in East Falmouth. If you look on the right, you'll see detections of 0.6 parts per billion. But a street right down the road shows the detections beginning at 2 and then jumping to 9,000, then to 10,000, and further on down the road, because the water now sits longer in the pipes, the elevations jump to 11,000 parts per billion. This same neighborhood in 1981 had detections of 20,000 parts per billion. And pipes associated with the Fresh Pond well was pumping out contaminated water with PCE with concentrations at 49,000 parts per billion. That's 10,000 times above the safe drinking water level. Even if you didn't live on these streets, but your kids went to the high school in the 1980s, they too were being exposed. This went on during the 1970s, the 80s, and into the 1990s, where streets were still being reported above the safe drinking water level. And in the year 2000, this street had a detection of 19 parts per billion. But the town report said that the levels in the town were at 9.2 parts per billion and not a violation. This troubled me. So I figured, who better to ask about this than the Falmouth Town Water Manager, Mr. Ray Jack, who inherited this problem when he took his position back in the 1990s.
Well, for certain regulations, of which this is one, the PCE regulations for the maximum contaminant level, whenever it's recognized that throughout the Commonwealth, many communities are going to have the same problem, and it's going to take them years to resolve it, whether they loop the mains or whether they replace the mains. Given that, then the state felt that it wasn't a responsible action to hold a town in violation for a problem that they didn't cause and realistically could not correct in any kind of immediate fashion. So therefore, anytime that those towns were on monitoring programs, by virtue of being on a state-required monitoring program, they did not consider that a violation.
The following is a list of towns in the Commonwealth that have this vinyl lined pipe.
From DEP were some fairly spotty information based in the late 1980s, very early 1990s, which essentially indicated that towns, of which Falmouth is one, that installed asbestos-lined pipe and had dead-end conditions where it was problematic. There were several options that the towns had. They were supposed to institute bleeders on those mains immediately if the results were above the MCL. They were supposed to loop them if possible, and I believe that the third option was replacement of the main. Those weren't directives, those were suggestions given to the town. And prior to my arrival, I know that the town's position was that there was not funding available, and therefore they had instituted bleeders as the immediate solution to the problem. So virtually all of those locations, there were no other actions taken up until that time.
So the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, came up with a plan to first monitor some of the locations where the vinyl lined pipes existed, and to initiate a flushing program in an attempt to lower the PCE concentrations. Remember, not all the streets have sampling locations. Here is a neighborhood in East Falmouth with over 200 homes. From what I can tell, these streets have never been monitored, never been flushed, and these people have never been notified. What about them?
It was my understanding at the time that the 32 locations represented all of the dead-end locations for AC pipe. I've since found that that's not necessarily true, but it's my understanding that there was a study performed whereby the town did look at all the dead-end mains and identified specific sites for testing, submitted those to DEP for approval as specific sites, and of course received approval from DEP to require periodic monitoring of those sites. Could be anywhere from semi-annual or twice a year to quarterly.
I've seen them drain the hydrant up my way. I haven't seen them drain that much, but I've seen them do this, but I haven't seen them do it for a year or so. When I was about 70, I guess.
The bleeder program consisted of flushing the water out from the hydrants. The solution to pollution is dilution. Keep the water moving. Get the concentrations down. This bleeding program allowed thousands of gallons of contaminated water to be flushed out into the streets, 85,000 gallons per day in the town of Falmouth. In one street alone, 14,000 gallons per day were flushed out of the pipes. Where does 14,000 gallons go when it's dumped out into the streets? It goes into the ground, down through the soil, into the groundwater. The same groundwater the military, no, the taxpayer, has just spent $500 million to clean up. Now imagine, if you will, hundreds of thousands of gallons a day being flushed out into the neighborhoods in all the towns involved with this program. The water back into the streets where people walk and children play. And in this location, 14,000 gallons a day were flushed out into a wetland. Has anyone ever heard of the Clean Water Act? Well, who better to ask that question than the United States Environmental Protection Agency?
For their concurrence, because the town samples their water supplies on a regular basis, whether it's either weekly or monthly, and they submit those reports to the DEP. And those reports go to the DEP for their review and approval. So I would think that the DEP would have final say on whether there is a violation or not.
I think we'd all be concerned, but again, what we can be concerned about and what we have the authority to go, if DEP is the organization that's responsible for regulating it, we'll certainly be concerned. I can't sit here and say that EPA is going to be concerned about some specific violation when I'm not even sure what the regulations are and who's really responsible for it. So I think it's a difficult question to be asking us. Obviously the answer is yes. People at EPA are concerned when anybody's dumping contamination into the ground. Why didn't we do something about it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure who was responsible. What regulatory group was responsible. I think if we were responsible and didn't do anything about it, obviously shame on us. But I think that was probably not the case, although I don't know the details.
Those are all run individually by each town, because some towns have their own water districts, such as Bourne, which are independent from the town, and Falmouth has their own, which is part of the town. So, and any violations would go through the DEP, would not go through us. So our involvement, really we didn't have any involvement with any water supply, individual water supply issues with any of the individual towns. Well, I would assume that the town would make the first determination, and that would have to go to DEP for their concurrence, because the town samples their water supplies on a regular basis, whether it's either weekly or monthly, and they submit those reports to the DEP. And those reports go to the DEP for their review and approval. So I would think that the DEP would have final say on whether there is a violation or not.
The town drinking water supply issues in general are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a federal regulation, but is handed down to the state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to oversee and regulate. That's general drinking water issues. So each town has a responsibility to provide safe drinking water to their consumers under state oversight.
What's wrong with this picture? Well, consider this. When technicians go out to sample groundwater contamination from the military reservations, TCE or PCE solvent plumes, they are required to have OSHA training and to wear a Tyvek suit, hard hat, rubber gloves, and safety goggles, and to undergo a full medical evaluation each year. Meanwhile, residents on these streets with vinyl-lined pipes have been exposed to PCE at elevations thousands of times higher than any of these plumes from the military reservation, day in and day out.
But the individual water supplies are managed, are managed by the state, the DEP on a local level, not by EPA.
Yeah, I think, again, we're, working with MMR within the Superfund program. So there, a lot of the questions you're asking have to do with, they don't have to do with the Superfund site. And when you have a Superfund site, we're operating under certain set of regulations. And when you move out into the town and their water supply, there may be other people in EPA who would be involved. But basically, most of the water supply issues are regulated by the state. So we're probably not going to have very many answers to these questions. Again, it's not that I've never heard of the bleeder program. I I didn't grow up on the Cape. I don't live on the Cape, and it's something that I don't believe has received a lot of general publicity. Probably people on the Cape are aware of it. It's not something that, even being at EPA, that I was familiar with, because it's not one of the things that I don't deal with water supply in general.
The DEP, work with the DEP.
Department of Environmental Protection.
The DEP.
Those to DEP.
Fall on DEP.
If DEP is the organization that's responsible for regulating it.
Not to pass the buck here, Kevin, but I would think that if there was a bleeder program in each of the individual towns, and I would assume that the DEP would have to approve that, approve the quantity of water, where it's going to be discharged to, and whether there was going to be any subsequent monitoring requirements as a result of that discharged water.
During this journey, many roads have led to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. But after twice requesting in writing, the DEP, the administrative agency managing the PCE vinyl line pipe program, has respectfully declined an interview.
We initiated what's come to be known as the Upper Cape Cancer Incidence Study. And that study involved investigation on our part as to what would be the likely candidates for investigation. Certainly we were going to investigate the military base because the state really wanted us to investigate that. But we were also looking for other sources of pollution that might be important. And we had already known about the episode of the vinyl line pipe and the drinking water contamination and of PCE. And so we decided that that was an important thing for us to investigate. In 2 investigations so far, we've found a modest increase in the risk of breast cancer among women who had high exposure levels.
Women who lived on those streets.
Yes, so they definitely, you had to live on the street or downstream from the street and to have been exposed. And we found associations with lung cancer, with leukemia, and with bladder cancer in our own research. And of course, we put this into the context of other studies that have been done that have been primarily done among dry cleaning workers and other occupationally exposed groups. Well, there are all different, ways that you can get exposed. So you could get exposed by inhaling. You could get exposed through dermal exposure, say by bathing in water that's contaminated, or by, drinking water and cooking with it. Basically, we took people who had different kinds of cancer, and we took people who basically didn't have cancer, and we located them because many people move around and they don't necessarily live on Cape Cod, but at least for the cancer patients, we knew that they were living on Cape Cod at the time of their diagnosis. And mostly, it depended on the study, but mostly we did telephone interviews with everybody, the people with cancer and the controls. And part of the interviews was getting a 40-year residential history. So if they lived in Chicago, Illinois, they told us about that. But then when they mentioned Cape Cod, we got their exact street address. So for all of the addresses that they had on Cape Cod, we found out what they were. And then we took that information and we literally mapped it. We put it on, in our very early studies, we physically put it on a paper map. Now we do it by computer using a geographic information system. And so we know where the people lived and when they lived there. And we know who has cancer and who doesn't. Then we got all of the information from the various water companies about where the vinyl-lined asbestos cement pipes were installed. And we computerized all of that information too. So we could see who was living adjacent to a pipe, vinyl-lined pipe, and who lived downstream, who lived upstream. So we found that, the time of the pipe installation was very important. That if you moved into a home where there was freshly installed vinyl-lined pipe, you got a bigger exposure than if you moved in, say, 7 or 14 years later. how wide the pipes were, how long they were, how many other houses were on that pipe also drawing off water. And we worked with them to develop an algorithm to figure out who might have high exposure, medium, low exposure, and also people who were unexposed. And then we looked to see, we compared the cases with cancer and the controls, and to see if there was a difference between them in their exposure levels.
Now today, that has shifted quite a bit. People are more concerned, and I get this on a weekly basis from people calling in. People are more concerned about property. You know, should I buy a house in this particular area? Is it near a plume? If it is near a plume or on a plume, what does that mean? Am I at risk? Is this going to affect my property value? And that's really the type of calls that we're getting now, where we didn't get those type of calls 15 years ago.
I mean, I would, if I were living on one of the streets, I would want to see, you know, the results myself. I would want to make sure that they're below the MCL. I mean, and the goal really is to have zero contamination in the water, right? It's, you know, I think that's even a stated goal by the EPA. Is
Real estate agents have what is known as a plume disclosure form. I approached 5 real estate agents to see if they were willing to give me an interview. I want to ask them why it is there's a notification form when in fact there are no homes that are being adversely affected by the plumes coming from the military reservation. There is no such thing as a vinyl line pipe disclosure form that would notify people who are buying homes that the house that they are buying resides on a street that has vinyl line pipes and there's potential for PCE contamination. Everyone declined to give me an interview. For some reason, it seemed to be okay to be selling people homes when there's a potential for drinking contaminated water. But you have to remember this. It's taken the town of Falmouth 30 years to get their water supply to the safe drinking water level. And that's after flushing thousands of gallons of water through the pipes on the streets that they sample. But remember, not all the streets have been flushed. Not all the streets have been sampled. And it only stands to reason that people in those neighborhoods, there's a high probability that they are still being exposed to PCE contamination. At what level? No one knows. But it seems no one really cares.
We really want to try to identify, say for breast cancer, some preventable risk factors. It's very frustrating that for such a common disease that there haven't been identified the types of risk factors for which, you know, there could be some action taken. And so we've really found this to be a very promising area of research, just looking at, say, at the all sorts of different aspects of the environment and breast cancer, this being one of them. I have really also a lot of interest in early life exposures and what might be the long-term consequences of that, and trying to figure that out better. And not just looking at, say, a woman's nutrition, but also factors that she has absolutely no control over. And things like what's in their drinking water. But I think that really everyone wants to have clean water. We, you know, have laws in place to make sure that our water is clean. And I think that whether or not you know, there's a link to a particular disease that's firmly established is just part of it. I mean, I think that there needs to be an effort to have clean water, where that's an expectation that we have.
I don't know how many people have been hurt by this. I feel many have. And you have to ask, why has the DEP declined to give an interview? And where is the voice of the environmental activists? What is the purpose of having agencies in place to protect public health that have done nothing about this? I don't know how many people are still being hurt by this, but I think we need to find out.